American intelligence and law enforcement agencies have now identified nearly a dozen Americans who have traveled to Syria to fight for the Islamic State, also known as ISIS. The extremist group has seized broad swaths of territory in recent months, and with that, they've also attracted more foreign fighters. The numbers reported vary, but thousands of ISIS fighters are now thought to hold Western passports. Meanwhile, we're just learning that at least 4 hostages held in Syria by ISIS were waterboarded after being captured. That's according to a report put out by the Washington Post. Freelance journalist James Foley was apparently one of those hostages. The 4 were waterboarded using a model similar to that of what the CIA used to torture suspected terrorists after 9/11. And despite U.S. aid drops that took place earlier this month, thousands of Yazidis are still facing a dire humanitarian situation. Many are scattered in refugee camps, while others have been kidnapped or killed at the hands of ISIS. Yazidis represent an ancient religious minority in Iraq and therefore are a prime target for an extremist group that's looking to form a purely Islamic State. But that attempt to eliminate religious minorities is not only happening in Iraq. You can also see it just across the border with Christians in Syria, where groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS now control broad swaths of territory. According to a recently released report from the State Department, persecution of Christians in Syria is part of the worst displacement of religious communities in recent history. The conditions for Christians in Syria is something that Virginia State Senator Richard Black has long been outspoken about. In fact, back in May, the senator wrote an open letter to President Bashar al-Assad thanking him for his, quote, heroic rescue of Christians. In the letter, he said, "I pray that the Syrian armed forces will continue to exhibit extraordinary gallantry in the war against terrorists. Please convey my personal thanks to the Syrian Arab Army and Air Force for protecting all patriotic Syrians, including the religious minorities who face death at the hands of the foreign jihadists." Given the growth of ISIS in recent months, should the U.S. throw more support behind President Assad? To discuss, I was joined earlier by Senator Richard Black, and I first asked him to talk about why he felt compelled to write this letter.
Well, I've been a little bit like the boy who said the emperor has no clothes. The whole world has been sort of in a state of groupthink, where no one is willing to break out and begin to look at things in a very realistic manner. I wrote a letter to President Assad that said essentially 2 things. The first thing, the Syrian forces had swept the Kalaman mountain range, where there are many villages that are occupied by Christians. And I thanked him for the very courageous battles of the Syrian army that liberated the Christians, including 13 nuns who had been held as human hostages. So that was number 1, is thanking him for the rescue of the Christians. Number 2 is I told him that I could not explain how the United States, which suffered 3,000 deaths, people who were sent to a fiery death on 9/11, how we could then come out in support of Al-Qaeda, which was the very group that murdered all of these Americans. So those were the 2 things I talked about with President Assad.
And do you believe that actually showing support for President Assad will translate into greater protections for these Christians?
Well, I think I'm very concerned about the Christians in the Middle East. There were a great number of Christians who managed to survive for centuries and centuries until we began to take aggressive action towards different countries in the Mideast. We have had a tremendous loss of Christians in Iraq. We almost had a tremendous loss in Egypt until, fortunately, President El-Sisi took over, and he is very much a protector of the Christians there. In Syria, President Assad and his father before him have both been steadfast protectors of the Christian community. And so by reinforcing what his army did to rescue the Christians, this was my way of trying to reinforce those efforts, because the Christians are under enormous pressure in the Middle East today.
Well, the U.S. has a long-standing record of supporting countries that uphold human rights. How do you expect the U.S. to really support the Assad regime, considering it has a pretty dire human rights record?
Well, the human rights record is it's a combination of truth, myth, and propaganda. I think that those who are very close observers of what's going on in Syria have come to believe that the sarin gas attack in Ghouta, in the suburbs of Damascus, was in fact launched by rebels who were working in coordination with the Turkish government. There have been some excellent articles reported. Seymour Hersh wrote a very fine article called "The Red Line and the Rat Line," in which he discussed the rebels' use of the sarin gas attack as a pretext